Jack fell as he'd have wished, the mother said, and folded up the letter that she had read. The colonel writes so nicely, something broke in the tired voice that quivered to a choke. She half looked up. We mothers are so proud of our dead soldiers. Then her face was bowed. Quietly the brother officer went out. He told the poor old dear some gallant lies that she would nourish all her days, no doubt. For while he coughed and mumbled, her weak eyes had shone with gentle triumph, brimmed with joy, because he'd been so brave, her glorious boy. He thought how Jack the cold-footed useless swine had panicked down the trench that night the mine went up at the wicket corner, how he tried to get sent home, and how at last he died, blown to small bits, and no one seemed to care, except that lonely woman with white hair. Siegfried Sassoon was born 8th of September 1886 in Matfield, Kent. Despite what is sometimes claimed, he had no German ancestry. His father was Jewish, and his mother was an Englishwoman. He was named after the hero of Wagner's musicals, for whom his mother had a fondness. His father was disinherited for marrying a Gentile woman, and therefore Siegfried ended up inheriting most of the family's fortune. As such, he spent most of his early youth in the gentlemanly pursuits of riding, cricket, and poetry. Motivated by patriotism, Sassoon joined the army in the early days of war, offering his services to the Sussex Yeomanry, but his deployment was delayed as a consequence of a broken arm he suffered while horseback riding. As such, he did not see action until the May of 1915, when he was commissioned as a second lieutenant with the 3rd Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. In November of the same year, he was sent to France with the 1st Battalion, where he met the fellow poet Robert Graves. Through their mutual passion for verse, the two became friends. Graves' gritty realism soon left its mark on Sassoon's poetry. This, combined with an increasing sense of war weariness, caused the young man's poetry to move from its early romanticism into the jaded realism for which Sassoon is known. As for many a young man, the Western Front was no picnic for Sassoon. The bloody scenery of bloodshed, sepsis, suicide, death, and destruction eventually took their toll on the sensitive senses of the poet and drove him into a mad despair. Contrary to what you might expect of someone of his vocation, this depression manifested itself in feats of suicidal bravery. He took part in increasingly mad trench raids, at one time single-handedly capturing a German trench, having scattered its 60 inhabitants with grenades. On another occasion, during a raid on enemy's trenches, he remained 1.5 hours under rifle and bomb fire, collecting and bringing in the wounded. Owing to his courage and determination, all the killed and wounded were brought in, to quote his citation. This bravery earned him the Military Cross. No man other than Graves was more aware of his suicidal bravery, for which he was even nominated for a Victoria Cross. The men of his company reportedly did not feel safe unless Siegfried was with them. But the horrors of war finally caught up with him. In August 1916, Sassoon arrived at Somerville College, Oxford, which was used as a hospital for convalescing officers with a case of gastric fever. Something finally broke inside of him. After his convalescent leave ended, he refused to return to active duty, opting instead to write "Finished with War," a soldier's declaration. Encouraged by the likes of Bertrand Russell and Lady Ottoline Morrell, this manifesto of fatigue of war opened, "I am making this a statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of all soldiers. I believe that a war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them, and that, had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. The protest continued. I have seen and endured the suffering of troops, and I can no longer be party to prolong these sufferings for these ends I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of a war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are now being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced upon them. Also, I believe it may help to destroy the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not enough imagination to realize. A soldier's declaration was forwarded to the press and read out in the House of Commons by a sympathetic member of the Parliament. The letter, which was seen by some as treasonous, nearly cost Sassoon his life. But instead of being accused of treason and court-martialed, he was declared mentally unfit and sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland. There he was under the auspices of the famous W.H.R. Rivers, but more importantly, he met and fell in love with Wilfred Owen. When The Hero, the opening poem, first appeared in print, it caused a stir. It did not sit well with the idea of noble heroic death for one's country. It did not sit well with the propaganda machine that promoted it. It did not sit well with the bulbous men and grubby, feather-distributing women who promoted the delusion from the comfort of their own home. It did not sit well with the old lie, dulce et decorum est. It did not even sit well with some of the fellow soldiers who wished to maintain the delusion. But there is nothing sweet or glorious about being ripped to shreds by fragmentation shells or drowning in the mud as you try in vain to recapture that captured 60-foot hill. His declaration, likewise, honored many a prominent and public figure. Apart from being an open and wilful act of treason, even some fellow soldiers, thought it was declaring a monopoly on virtue, as if he was the only one who had the moral courage to say, "I can no longer see men being led to their death." So what is the connection, you ask, between the mad but courageous testament of a soldier that nearly cost him his life and a poem about a mother being told sweet lies about her son's death? The hero and declaration share a common thread, breaking the conspiracy of silence, telling those old senile sheep on the so-called home front about the absurdity of it all, rebellion against a meat grinder that has long lost all meaning. It is the old question of them versus us, those who believe in the lies that grease the creaky wheels of the old war machine, and the jaded soldiers who know better. Those oblivious souls on the home front that preach from the gospel of lies, and those who die in the mud in utter hopelessness. Sure, you could call it caddish, you could call it monopolizing virtue, you could call it a mockery of this and that, you could even call it an act of treason. But this does not change the fact that something had to be said, and someone had to be the first to say it. And who better to say it than a decorated war hero known for his bravery, with a pen sharper than a shell fragment? Sassoon went back to the front in France late in war. He survived the war, even though he was almost fatally wounded by friendly fire. His admirer and friend, Owen, however, was not so lucky. Declaration was only the beginning of Sassoon's disobedience. Even the end of the war did not mean he would stop spreading the word of horrors he and his fellow men had endured. These continued well into the post-war period and included the publication of his best-known collection of poems, the War Poems of Siegfried Sassoon, published in 1990. The post-war years were kinder on Sassoon. He found employment as the editor for Daily Herald. He traveled through Europe and embarked on the tour of the USA. Sassoon was appointed Commander of the Order of British Empire, CBE, in the 1951 New Year's Honours. He died from stomach cancer on the 1st of September 1967, 1 week before his 81st birthday. At the time, he was working on a novel. He is buried at St. Andrew's Church, Mells, Somerset, not far from the grave of Father Ronald Knox, whom he admired. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Pens of August, a series wherein I explore the literary aspects of the Great War. I hope to see you again in the future.